World. I'm Mike Walsh, your host and moderator for this session. This is going to be an exciting one because we've heard a lot about AI, of course, in these last few days and for the last decade, but most of that AI has been AI that reacts, predicts, and optimizes. But what we're going to talk about today is something really much more profound, which is autonomous AI agents. And autonomy really changes everything because when you start thinking about autonomous intelligence, it really puts the presumption on leaders to think about how can we do that safely? What does it mean for the way we need to design new kinds of 21st century organizations? And how does that ultimately change our relationship between those AI agents and us as human leaders? So thankfully, we've got a great guest to talk about these complicated questions. I'm joined with John Roese, who I think needs very little introduction. He's one of the industry's most thoughtful voices on the future of AI and intelligent systems. We're going to take a high-level look at the future of agentic AI. John, it's great to see you again.
No, great to see you, Mike.
I think we last spoke about a year ago, and we were joking about this backstage, that a year can go past and it feels like the whole world's changed.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I always found most interesting about you is you from the very beginning, had a very definitive view of what agentic AI was and what it wasn't. So maybe, I guess, from a business standpoint, what is an AI agent?
Yeah, we built our first autonomous agents almost 2 years ago before the term was even a term. And so we got started early, but then, last year, agentic became a word that people started to use, and here we are today where I will guarantee you it's being misused broadly because it's a cool term, so let's call everything an agent. And unfortunately, it does a tremendous disservice because agentic is a very different capability in the AI era. It is not a chatbot that just is unlocking and generating data as a tool. It is something extremely different. It is a technology that is focused on the digitization of work. It is autonomous, it can reason, it can use tools, it can have memory, it can have specialized knowledge, it can interact with other agents, they can work as ensembles. Do any of those things sound like a chatbot? And they are not the same things, but we've unfortunately commingled those worlds and called everything an agent. For this discussion, we need to separate them, because you cannot talk about the human and organizational dynamics if you are confusing a productivity tool versus an autonomous, reasoning-capable entity that is capable of doing work however you define it. And so suspend any definitions you have. Whatever we talk about when we use the word agent, it's something that autonomously is able to do work. Now, we'll talk about what kind of work and how that happens, but that has been probably the most profound problem we've had this year, because the confusion about what it is to begin with either underestimates or overestimates the capability.
Yeah, and I think you've mentioned this before, but a chatbot using RAG to surface insights from a database, or a RPA system that's running on deterministic rails. I mean, these things have been useful in the past, but the technology's evolved now that we can actually give these agents autonomy to take action themselves.
Exactly. And by the way, don't get me wrong, all of Dell's impact, and we've had some pretty big impact on our business, you've seen it, we are doing extremely well, we started early on AI. Almost every major project that we've run for the last 2 years was based on chatbots and RAG. It may be a little bit of machine learning. We didn't use a lot of agents in the early days. We didn't need to, because the entire first phase of generative AI, which by the way is still worth doing, was about unlocking all of our proprietary data and making the experience incredibly different and more accessible. When you shift into the agentic world, I sometimes say there's two things that make an enterprise an enterprise. The first is what you know. If you don't know anything that other people know, then you really have a weak source of differentiation. But if you know something, if you have information and data that is captive in your environment, that is special, it is a source of differentiation. By the way, chatbots unlocked that. They made that very valuable. The second source of differentiation in any organization is your ability to do certain things, certain types of work better than other people. If you are a better engineer, or a better computer scientist, or a better carpenter, or a better artist, that is a skill that you have that other people don't do as well as you. What's interesting about agentic is it is squarely targeted at that. It is about digitizing the skills of your organization, not just unlocking your data. And because of that, when we think about doing work, having a skill, well, do you do work and have a skill in isolation, in a room with no one around you and no tools? No, you interact with the world around you when you do work. You use tools, you access data, you collaborate, and all of those analogies have made their way into how agents work. And so it would be ridiculous to think of an agent not being able to use tools, because almost all work is about giving someone a task and then giving them the tools and resources to do that task, which is, in this case, is just all digital in most cases. And so we see these interesting parallels between kind of the human world and how it does work, and the agentic world, how work is forming, and that's by design, because they're coexisting in the same enterprise.
I think it also follows that just like there's no one set of skills, there's going to be different sets or types of agents.
Yeah.
And you've developed a taxonomy of classifying those agents.
Yeah, we had this big question as we started building agents. Well, by the way, the order of operations was interesting. We've been building and deploying agents for about 2 years. We have lots of agents running, and they were all kind of a one-off. We were like, well, we can use this technology to go solve a coordination problem, or we can go use it to clean up our CRM data, or we could go use it to automate our coding process. But after we did a bunch of them, I started to think, is there a pattern here? Are these all one-offs, or are they falling into some kind of structure? And so we inventoried them, and then we looked for any kind of correlation in them, and we found a correlation. Imagine in your mind a 2x2 graph, and on the x-axis, it is degree of automation. Over here, you're not giving it a lot of autonomy. Over here, you're giving it full autonomy. Give it an objective and let it figure it out. On the y-axis, down to the bottom, it's simple processes you're doing, something very simple like send an email. But at the top are complex processes, get a quote, build software. And so we looked at that and we found that there was a pattern, and the pattern formed with every agent we had built fell into one of 4 patterns on that chart. In the bottom left, if you have low autonomy and simple work, we realized that those were nothing more than productivity tools. We have hundreds of them in Dell embedded into our sales chat tool and other things. And what they do is they take a task and they just do it for you. And they use agents to do that. They're very simple agents, but they do some reasoning. But it's very clear. Book my travel, send this paper, call this customer. Very, very simple. Humans very much the center of it, but that's one type of agent. It works. Right next to it, across the y-axis, we had agents that were high autonomy, but were still doing simple work. And what we meant by that is there was almost no human involvement. And the first ones that we built we built an agent because we realized our CRM data was inaccurate. By the way, all CRM data is inaccurate. It's not a pretty sign, it gets old quickly. And we couldn't fix it in the past because to fix CRM data is a very expensive proposition. Either your salespeople spend a bunch of time doing hygiene work, or you hire people to do it. None of it makes any sense economically, so you live with bad data. But now we have these autonomous entities, these things that are not scripts. You can give them an objective, and you can give them a set of tools.
Hygiene agents.
Hygiene agents. We actually call them hygiene or steward agents. And so we built them and realized that's a pattern. Then there's lots of things where if you give an agent an objective, give it some data, give it some tools, very simple goal, it's able to reason, it's able to do that work, and suddenly, magically, your CRM data is clean because something behind the scenes is doing that work that no human being would ever want to do. Then you jumped up a level, upper right-hand quadrant, and we said, what if it's a complex task, but you're not giving it a lot of autonomy? Is there something about agents there? And we realized, yeah, they're used for coordination. We found a bunch of agents that their job was not to do the work, their job was to understand a complex workflow and make sure everybody else did their job. We've used that in our factories. We're looking at using it for techniques like handing off an account between 2 sales reps. Sales rep leaves the company, new sales rep comes in, it's almost always a train wreck because the person responsible has a day job and the other people don't know and the other person isn't there. But if you actually look at the process, it's very clear. What if an entity woke up on Monday morning and its job for the next week was to make sure that happened, and that's all it did? It could communicate to people, it knew what good was. It's kind of a boring thing, but imagine the impact if every process in the organization is kind of guided to a successful outcome. Again, not super sophisticated, but it is about complex processes, not a lot of creative license, but just execution. And then we found this upper quadrant, which is high complexity and high autonomy, and we called those expert agents. Those are very hard to build. Our quoting system that we are trying to build, and it will take us a while to get this one right, requires 9 different agents working with each other because the process spans multiple organizations, it's very subjective, it's very complex. We think they are buildable, but they are probably the hardest kind of agent to build today because you're dealing with a complex system and a high degree of autonomy for the first time. Anyway, we put that chart together, and it turns out that was about 4 or 5 months ago. Every agent we can contemplate falls into one of those patterns. It's just simply given us some clarity that agents are not all the same in terms of the type of work they do, but the type of work they do is also not infinitely diverse. It turns out, most work is just hygiene, productivity, coordination, or expert. And if you understand that and use that type of framework, suddenly you know where to look for the work that agents might be able to do. The other takeaway is we realized building agents is not universally the same amount of effort. Building a productivity tool is quite simple. You can do that all day long. Building a hygiene agent is a little harder, but it's actually not very complex if you have the right systems in place. Coordination agents are a little bit harder, but totally achievable if the process is well defined. Experts are hard. And so it led us to a conclusion that in the near term, we are less obsessed about building, digital salespeople and digital architects, and we are more focused on building agents that take that hygiene, productivity, and coordination work off the hands of human beings and out of the human workforce and into the agentic workforce. And it just gave us some guardrails to correlate this technology to the thing that it was doing, which was work, in a way that wasn't a random exercise every time we built one.
Aside from the fact that I think you've discovered your own Myers-Briggs personality test for agents.
Yes, exactly.
What do you
ESTJ there or something, yeah.
The other thing I think this gets to is it really gets to the source of what drives value with agents.
Yeah.
Because just because you sign up for an agentic platform or you give everyone access to some kind of co-pilot doesn't actually necessitate you're going to get a real ROI.
Yeah.
But if you're building agents that are demonstrably creating value, it's a game changer.
Yeah.
So where are you seeing that, taking this approach with different types of agents, how does that actually start to change the way we design the firm or the enterprise?
If you've ever heard me speak on this topic, we have a very strong point of view about you never do an AI project from the technology. The technology is the last thing you deal with. You start with what problem are you trying to solve? Why are you doing this? And so even what I just talked about was just kind of an inventory and organization of agents. You don't start there. You start with a discussion around, are there things in my business that if I were to change them, to do them better, they would create a source of competitive advantage? And in the old world, let's say Gen 1 of generative AI, we chose big projects. The way we build software, the way we predict the future in our supply chain, the way we service our customers. And they were very, very large scale projects, and we concentrated our energy, and every one of them had a 10 or 30 to 1 ROI, and they bent the needle in the company, and we got really good results. Agentic's a little different because, one, the speed in which you can apply agents to solve a problem is quite a bit faster. And if you build the infrastructure and everything correctly, the cost to do them is actually significantly more manageable. You can just move faster. And so you have to, when you start the agentic journey, you still start with what problem am I trying to solve? But now you can go and look for, I'll call them smaller problems, or problems that are less, tectonic shifts in the world and more things that change the nature of work within a role. Again, they should all create value. They should all correlate to some kind of financial or business impact. But let me give you an example. We have a pattern that's formed now in some of the early agents that we're building right now. We realize there's a problem in companies. And I will say that in all companies. Raise your hand after I say this. If you disagree with me and you don't have this problem, I'm going to guess you have this problem. The distance between the data you need to make a decision and you is almost always quite far. And by the way, the more senior you are in a company, the further that data gets from you. For me to make an intelligent decision, I have to have data. That data today gets to me through a theater of meetings and dashboards and organizations and people that are there, with good intention to eventually give me the data I need, but sometimes that data might take a month to reach me.
Sometimes by design.
By design, yes. There's a whole industry of being the keepers of data. By the way, that's dead. If that's your job description, find another job, that's going away. But what we realized is agents can do work. What if the work I asked them to do, very specific, and these are hygiene agents, interestingly enough,
right,
is I need this data. I need it always to be accurate. I need it to be presented to me, and I need it organized in this way. I'm not asking it to make a decision. I'm not asking it to do anything other than get me the data I need. Now, the reason I'm using agents is APIs are not sufficient. Dashboards are not the right tool. I don't want a BI tool. I want interaction with my data. I want it to be living. I want it to be working on my behalf. I want it to be hyper-personalized. And so, interestingly enough, so we built these. And what we found is if the data exists in a digital format and I have the rights to it, because it's my agent, it's using my identity and my control framework, then I can task it to do that work. And it turns out it works. You can grab that data, it can organize it, it presents it back to me in a dashboard, but I can interact with the dashboard. I can give it tasks. I can tell it, oh, the data you gave me last week was good, but I wish you had this information, and it will evolve. And suddenly what I've done is I punched a hole right through the bureaucracy, that all the theater that sat between me and that data is gone. I don't need anybody in the middle. I don't need a readout. I don't need a dashboard. All I need is the data when I need it. Now, that sounds like a very abstract concept, but when you think about changing a business, having a material impact, once you see that pattern, you realize everywhere in the company, you are moving slower than you could because you can't get the data that you need to make an intelligent decision in real time.
You can see the power of compressing decisions, but this efficiency is not free.
Oh, no.
And I think one of the things that people often underestimate is that even in a world of abundant intelligence, the scarcity just moves to other stuff like infrastructure and power.
Absolutely. And but the other thing that we've learned is that if there are a diverse set of agents doing a diverse set of work, maybe there's only 4 kinds of work and maybe it's simpler than we think it will be, they are not all equal in terms of the economic value they produce. So let me give you, I'll take the 2 examples I just gave you. An agent that cleans up CRM data is actually a fairly useful tool, except you know why we don't clean up CRM data? The cost to do it per unit is too high. What's the per unit value of having a clean CRM record? I don't know, 50 cents? It's not a big dollar, but you have millions of them. And so humans doing that work, if it's a 50-cent unit value and it costs $12 in tokens to do it, that is a terrible idea. You should not do that. So in that particular scenario, you have to look at your infrastructure, and Jeff and Michael talked about this last couple of days, that you need choice. And in that case, what we found is to run those hygiene agents, we needed an infrastructure, tokens, systems, everything, that could produce an outcome at cents on the unit. You can't do that over a frontier model into a cloud. You can't do that over any API. Fortunately, we found a way to do it. We have GPU farms, so we have a scheduler, and we take our hygiene agents that aren't actually time sensitive, and we just batch them into the white space of the GPUs that aren't doing anything. So I already paid for the GPUs, I now just run this in the white space. Suddenly the economic cost of running a hygiene agent is basically free. So even if it produces 50 cents per unit, that's all upside. That's a tokenomics discussion. It's an economic discussion. You flip to the other side, which is the example of punching through the information barrier. Well, those are very high value. If you're talking about the CEO making a decision about the company, if you're talking about deploying your sales force and having intelligence on it, I am actually willing to pay a premium for that. And in those cases, even though it looks like simple work, I may actually want it, I definitely want it to run in real time. It's not going to run in the white space. I probably want it to be highly reliable. I absolutely want it to run in my infrastructure because the data I'm accessing is highly sensitive. And I probably want it to have a marginally good level of reasoning because I am asking it not just to throw raw data at me, but to distill the data in some way that I can interpret. And so, I don't know, what's the economic value of choosing, which roadmap for your multi-billion-dollar product is going to be the right path to take? Those are ones that I'm willing to pay a higher premium. And from a token economics perspective, I'm comfortable with that because the ROI makes sense. And so welcome to the new world. You're not only going to have to figure out what work to do with agents and what value it creates, but those different types of work do not produce enough value to fundamentally use the same infrastructure for everything. So you're going to have to manage your infrastructure as a set of diverse choices that have different economic thresholds so that you get a good ROI on all of these.
The terrifying thing about this is that all these new chief AI officers are going to end up reporting to the CFO.
We have a joke. Doug Schmidt and I, Doug's the CIO and I'm the chief AI officer and the CTO. And when we first realized this, some some companies were presenting very difficult and confusing economic models, and our joke with them is, well, in our contract, you guys should pay for a bunch of accountants because we're going to need them to sort this out. We think it will be better. We think actually model routing and topology orchestration will give you a way to make these industrialized. But today, you do need to kind of look at these things from a FinOps perspective at a much more deep level than we ever have, because if you get the financials wrong and you run a really interesting agent in an environment that makes it economically unviable, you've created a cost center as opposed to a business advantage. And so that's the world that we're going to have to be dealing with. But the output of it is, if you get it right, you have highly efficient changes in your enterprise that produce productivity and value at gigantic scale. So it's worth doing. It's just not necessarily something we've ever done before, and it's not something that's going to be easy initially, but it will get better as we start to industrialize these.
Well, I think the place that takes us to is really this question of competitive advantage. And if you're a technology leader who's trying to get the attention of the C-suite, getting them to invest more in agentic technology, in the end, they're going to want to know what advantage is this going to give us. Because we're in a world now where you have two companies with access to the same tools. They can work with the same technology stack. They can work with the same models. They can work with the same partners.
Yeah.
So why will one succeed and the other one fail?
Yeah, I mean, whatever you think your source of sustainable competitive advantage is in your structures are probably going to change. Now, I'll give you one real tangible example. If you write software, you probably believe that your source code is a source of competitive advantage. The code you write is an asset. The asset is unique to you, and quite frankly, you invested time and energy to create that software, and then you sell it to people, so the source code is valuable. If you are moving to spec-driven development, using agents to write software, your source code is not valuable anymore. And the reason for it is that when you use agents to build software, what is valuable is the spec that you create that describes what outcome you're trying to achieve. Once you have that spec, which is just a markdown file, it's not anything special, but what's in it is special. What it is not that complex. If I take that spec and go and sit in Claude Code, and I tell it to run that spec, it will produce a product that meets that spec. If I take the same thing and move it into anti-gravity at Google, it will produce a spec. If I move it to Windsurf, it will produce a product. The product, the actual source code, is ephemeral. It was created by one of many different agentic tools that you don't even really own. You're renting them or using them or buying them, but the spec is the important piece. And when you think about that is incredibly disruptive, because the barrier of entry, if someone had exactly the same spec and was competing with you, they could build the same product and they could do it very quickly in this system. Now, on the other hand, the spec itself should be protected. It is incredible. If you've ever seen a spec in spec-driven development, it is pages and pages and pages. It's very detailed. It analyzes the industry. It analyzes the market.
It's a business plan, basically.
It's a business plan. It's like the whole business plan and the technical details and some engineering magic in there. And that thing now needs to be the most important source of differentiation. But on the other hand, the spec can change. You can evolve it. And so the product ceases to be the most important thing. The knowledge to drive the AI tools becomes one of the sources of differentiation. The other is the speed in which you can execute. Because even if you do all that, but the only way your supply chain can produce a product and deliver it is over a 9-month period, and your competitor doing the exact same thing can deliver a product in a 3-month period, guess what? They win. And so those are sources of differentiation that weren't the same as today, but they're all changing.
Well, this ability to almost reverse engineer the code this is how Anthropic Mythos works.
Absolutely. If you're familiar with this thing called Mythos, which was kind of been in the news, the way that system works is a large language model looks at your code in production, your software, and then it basically recreates your source code. It doesn't scan your binary. It recreates the source code. It creates a product in source code that does what your software does, and then it analyzes that created source code to determine if there's bugs in it. That is quite surprising. It definitely challenges some intellectual property law issues and definitely creates some issues with contracts, but what it's showing you is your source code is recreatable. It's not even, you don't even have to have the spec. I can have the product and I can kind of create the source code from it. So the whole world is starting to change. One of the things we've realized is the only real sustainable source of differentiation from a product and technology perspective in the software world is the speed in which you can execute. The intellectual capability to know what to do is super important, and that's a huge asset, but if it's not coupled with a highly agile, fast-moving ability to take your idea into conception, you will largely lose. You heard Jeff this morning, by the way, he made comments, actually I don't think he said it in that meeting, but I have an MBO as the Chief AI Officer, and it's the time it takes us to go from idea to production. Last year, that time frame was 7.5 months, and that included procurement and GRC and legal and everything else. Today, it's less than 4 weeks. By the end of this year, it'll probably be less than a week. And it's standardizing tools, standardizing processes, using agentic. Speed matters. Speed is competitive advantage in the future, but only if you're using all of these tools to basically be able to dynamically create the right product at the right time and get it into the market first.
The natural enemy of speed in organizations is risk,
yes,
and guardrails and trust and ethics. So, we can only move as fast as the systems we trust to move us. So how do you balance that?
It's interesting. You have to rethink that. Today we have, a very classic way of looking at trust and risk. We use lawyers and security people, and they look at it from a conventional way. And that worked for a while. We're now changing that. We still have lawyers and security people, but we've changed the model. We've said, look, if we go from every AI project being a random adventure, that you kind of pick your own tools and do your own thing, there's no structure, then you need a lot of lawyers and security people to make sure you didn't do something dumb. But if, on the other hand, you deploy standardized platforms, you have a standardized operating model, you have a proper governance structure where the things you're doing are the things you should be doing in the right way, and then most importantly, you have trained people that know how to do this, you can relax some of those things. And in fact, our new principle that we're about to roll out is if you are doing an AI project on trusted platforms with a trusted use case, which means it's approved and we all agree it's the right thing to do and it's defined well, and with trusted people, which is code for certified people, that we've trained them, we know they know what they're doing, we give you a lot more latitude to move a lot faster. We still observe you and we still check, but the bottom line is I don't need to have that same level of scrutiny because I've contained the environment into something that says, you're following my rules, you're using my platforms, I've engineered them to be protected. In fact, the biggest thing that we did on agents is we created agentic guidelines last October that literally define how we're going to use agents, what the technical scaffolding is. We have rules. Every agent in the company, every agent that we use, every agent in a third-party environment must carry a Dell-issued digital identity on it. It must use our fine-grained authorization capability, so we have controls over it. It must emit its telemetry using open telemetry back to us. It must exist in the topology in the right place. There are rules now, and so if you're working in that environment where I've proactively created the proper guardrails, and you're doing it around something I agree you should do, and you're doing it with people who I trust, I'm going to let you go a lot faster, and I think I can do things in a week.
This is still complex because going to how we open this, we're now dealing with probabilistic autonomous systems. So, creating rules and policies for something that isn't deterministic, do we now need to be thinking about protocols rather than policies?
We do. In fact, we've been wrestling with this one. A lot of the problems we solve cannot be solved with a probabilistic system. And we learned this actually in our quoting agent. We discovered that as part of developing a quote, you have to define a configuration. Today, configurations are kind of handcrafted by people or a few tools. So somebody had the idea, why don't we have the large language model, the agent itself, come up with the configuration? You can imagine how that went. We put a bunch of configuration data into a probabilistic system and asked it for a configuration. If you asked it the same question 3 times, it gives you 3 very different answers. They're all right, but they're not predictable. We had another team say that's not going to work, so maybe because agents can use tools, why don't we have the agent run the process? And when it gets to the point that it needs a configuration, do an MCP call to the configurator, which is a piece of software that is entirely predictable, and then take that configuration forward. That discussion about what is probabilistic, what is stochastic, is incredibly important because when you're looking at work, go back to what agents do, they do work. You're looking at a workflow. Does that workflow tolerate a high degree of variability and interpretation and bias, or does it require kind of very specific answers somewhere in the journey? And it turns out the way that you get to that is not an agent doing everything in its reasoning logic. It's an agent doing the minimum sufficient reasoning to guide it through that process, and where you need stochastic behavior, you use tools to basically provide predictable outcomes. And that, software is not dead. It's just going to be dynamically created, and it's going to be instantiated when the agent decides that there's too much risk in me being probabilistic, and I'd rather outsource the work to a piece of software that will do it in a predictable way. Whether that's not here quite yet, but it's coming very quickly.
John, thank you for such a clear and thought-provoking discussion. I don't know about you, but the one thing I really took away from this is that this is really not a technical and technological issue at all. What we're really talking about is the fundamentals of leadership and what it takes to design great organizations.
I've been a CTO my entire career. I've been a technologist forever. I'm an electrical engineer, and for the last probably 5 months of my life as the Chief AI Officer, I've not spent as much time on technology as I have on psychology, sociology, organizational design, human interaction. We have to realize that when you're bringing a technology into the real world and you're impacting a workforce and you're changing the way people interact and how businesses run, if you cannot bridge that gap between the technology and the parameters that actually define humanity, you're going to get it wrong. And so it's actually been a lot of fun, but as you can tell, it's going to be an interesting transformation for everybody. But when we get there, what I will tell you is this stuff works. And when it works, it is transformational, and the impact is probably the highest impact we've ever seen, including bigger impact than the first generation of generative AI.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for joining us here. I hope this session's given you some new frameworks and, importantly, some new questions to take back to your organization. Please thank John.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. That's right.